Happy Valentine's Day, Bengals Nation. I don't know who is not celebrating that holiday. I know there are strong feelings on both sides of the fence about Valentine's Day, but we decided that we are going to do a live show and a recording of the show right around Valentine's Day, and it's a little appropriate in a number of different reasons. We're going to talk about in this show. We're going to talk about what we love about the Bengals. We're going to get to some listener questions. We've already been submitted a bunch already, so thank you so much on various platforms. And we're going to talk about some different plans that the Bengals could use with Cedric Ogbuehi going forward, because obviously he is a guy that they put a lot of stock in terms of anchoring that offensive line, and we know over the past two seasons that has not been a good output as of yet. But I'm Anthony Cosenza, by the way, in case you're new to this program, and I write for Cincy Jungle and co-host this show. And my co-host with me, my Valentine, my pre-Valentine, is Scott Schultze. Scott, how are you, sir?
I am doing really good, enjoying Shrove Tuesday before Ash Wednesday starts tomorrow. So, yeah, having a good Fat Tuesday.
Yeah.
As you can maybe tell, maybe not tell. I guess my belly's below the screen. So maybe you can't tell.
We, for those that are, ardent listeners of this program, and I know there are millions and millions of those, this program usually records on Wednesday night, and we put out the information and the videos, audio, all that stuff from there. We decided to do it a little earlier this week in case many of you are celebrating Valentine's Day, Ash Wednesday, anything like that tomorrow. And this time of year being what it is, we did take a week off last week. We're kind of, for now, doing every other week. I think by the time free agency and the draft kicks up, we'll be back on a weekly basis. But real quick, just some news and notes. The last time we were on the air, Scott, Alex Smith was traded to the Redskins and signed a huge contract with the Redskins. And now you have Jimmy Garoppolo doing the same. And I know that plays into a bit of Jimmy Garoppolo with the 49ers, that is. And I know that plays into a bit of a post that you put up on Cincy Jungle. I want to talk about that. We also have a new Super Bowl champion. That's the Philadelphia Eagles. They won Super Bowl 52. And Nick Foles played incredibly well. Again, I'm the king of the segues, my friend. That goes right into something you posted this week on Cincy Jungle, and I want to talk about that to kick off the show. Andy Dalton is a very polarizing figure amongst Bengals fans. There are a bunch of people who are, hey, I'm in Dalton's corner, and that's the guy for the Bengals. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. A lot of regular season wins, franchise record-setting single-season passing marks, 5 straight playoff berths. We could go on and on about all of the good things Andy Dalton has done. And Andy Dalton, the human being, is a great guy as well. Does a lot of stuff for the community in Cincinnati and all of that. Unfortunately, he has not gotten the Bengals over the hump. We've beat that dead horse a bunch. But now Marvin Lewis is back. There's been talk of change, though Mike Brown kind of brush that aside in recent interviews. And one of the big changes the Bengals could make is at quarterback, or at least do so for the foreseeable future, not necessarily in 2018, but at least kind of do the John Kitna, Carson Palmer thing that Marvin did back in 2003. Scott, you wrote something on Cincy Jungle kind of talking about the need of a quarterback for the Cincinnati Bengals. Obviously, this draft in rounds 1 through 3 is very heavily stocked at that position, and everybody has their favorites. Everybody has guys they don't like of that group. Can you talk a little bit about, in case our listeners didn't read that at Cincy Jungle, talk about your argument there and what you've proposed for the Bengals as they potentially look at all of the options going into the draft?
Okay, so yeah, essentially the article came out, I think a couple days ago, maybe a day or two ago, and the whole premise is you look at the quarterback position, and I basically feel that is in the modern NFL, where you're throwing 30, 40 times a game. You look at the rules opening the passing game in the league, it is arguably the single most important position on the field is the quarterback, and definitely a good quarterback. And you look at teams like the Green Bay Packers, their record with and without Aaron Rodgers is starkly different. You look at the Denver Broncos, their record, when they had Peyton Manning, and you look before and after, totally different. You look at the Colts, when they had, Luck and Peyton Manning, great records. When they have anyone else at quarterback over that same era, horrible records. You look at, same things with the Vikings, a few years back when they added Brett Favre, how that changed their, their winning. You look at Drew Brees when he joined the Saints. You look at the Cardinals when they got Kurt Warner. You go back over the past 10, 15 years since the league has become more of a open passing league. The teams that add a great quarterback or an elite quarterback have so much more success in the regular season and then also in the playoffs. You look at the Super Bowl winners, over the past, I forget, it was 15 years. It's Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, Tom Brady again, Ben Roethlisberger, Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, Brady some more, Roethlisberger some more, and even some of the quarterbacks have lost. You have Kurt Warner, Matt Ryan, so forth. So by and large, obviously not every time, but by and large, the teams that have a great quarterback have tons of success on the field. You change that one quarterback out, and they can go from bad to good. The single most important dictator of how well your team does. And then in the playoffs, the teams that have a great quarterback generally are the teams that are making it further in the playoffs, that are winning games and ultimately winning the Super Bowl. So that being said, that generally being the case, this year we saw that did not happen. This year, and then Joe Flacco back in Super Bowl 47 or whatever it was. You have
he's elite. He's elite, man.
Yeah, if you ask the right people, you ask you ask Ravens fans, and I'm sure there's some Eagles fans who might say Foles is elite. But outside of the exceptions, generally the great quarterback, is the most important position, more important than having, an AJ Green or a Vontaze Burfict or a Geno Atkins or whatever. That one position absolutely changes your fortunes. But we saw this year that didn't happen. Obviously Foles showed that, hey, if you have a lot of great pieces around you, you have a decent enough quarterback, it can be done. It's not regular, it's been a while, maybe it also happens again, but it's not an absolute rule that you have to have an elite quarterback. Definitely helps. But it's not, you can do it without having that. It's kind of like, you can get across the country walking. It's much easier to take a car or a plane, but you could do it walking. It's, not the prep. So that being said, Dalton is probably arguably somewhere around the Nick Foles level, a guy who has some success. You could argue is better than Foles based on their history. Obviously not the postseason history, but based on, the regular season and, success and things they've done. So that being said, the fact that the Eagles showed that, you can do it without an elite quarterback. Can we do it with Dalton? Is what the Bengals have in Dalton enough that they should just focus on the other positions, a center, a left tackle, a right tackle, linebackers, et cetera, or is that one position so important as the track records show time and time again that is the single most important position? Do the Bengals have to get an elite quarterback, which I think we'd agree they don't have? They have a nice one, a good one, solid one, steady one, game manager, above average, whatever, but he's not elite. If an elite one falls to them in the draft, and I'm not saying it would, I'm not saying any of these quarterbacks are elite. They might be, I don't know. Obviously time will tell. But if the Bengals feel one of these guys is elite, be it Rosen or Darnold or Allen or whoever, and if that guy falls to them, do they absolutely have to take him because that is that one position that is so important that if you have the next Aaron Rodgers or Brady sitting there, do you just have to take him, regardless of who else is there? Or do you build around Dalton figuring he can be a Nick Foles type situation and he's good enough? So that being said, I guess my personal contention is I think they have to take the quarterback. I think it is that important of a position that if they feel that guy's there, if they feel that, fill in the blank, Mayfield, Lamar Jackson, whoever, if they feel that guy falls to them and is that next absolutely elite, can't miss guy that's going to, totally change the face of your franchise, I think you absolutely have to take it, regardless of how good Dalton is, because Dalton's not elite. If you have that chance for that, once in a every few year elite guy, I think you absolutely have to take him regardless of what your other needs are, because that position is going to affect you so much more. I know a lot of people disagree with that. And on the post, there were a couple hundred comments. I think probably more of them disagreed than agreed. But anyway, that was my statement. That's my opening salvo.
It was a great post, and I encourage our listeners to go check that out. And obviously, if you've been around the Cincy jungle parts, or really just around the Bengals in the Andy Dalton era, as I mentioned before, there's a very staunch group who is pro Dalton, and there's a very staunch group who is anti Dalton. I like what you wrote in that post, Scott, because really it echoed a lot of things I've said recently, and what we've talked about on this program, and that makes me feel like a pretty smart guy when a gentleman like yourself puts it on to digital paper. We talked about when we've talked about this series on this show about improving the Bengals in 2018. We've talked about committing to a quarterback, and it could be Dalton, it could be a new guy. But in 2018, the Bengals need to either fully commit to Andy Dalton and say, this is the guy. Let's absolutely stack the offense. Let's get some more playmakers on defense. Let's really load up the roster around him and make him like an Alex Smith or someone like that who, is a good player, has some limitations, but good teams have been able to kind of prop those players up. I will say this, and this is almost any other franchise in the NFL, if they were in the state of the Bengals, had Andy Dalton as their quarterback, their roster is what it looks like at this point, I wouldn't really advocate for that team to grab a quarterback. I mean, really, Andy Dalton now is in his, 8th year, 7th year, and, he's put up some big numbers, and he's very durable. He's battled through some offensive line issues, major attrition over the past couple of years. I'm going to say this, though, because of the limitations the Bengals front office has, the way this franchise is run, and I've said this on this program, recently as well, if you, and this kind of plays into your argument, I believe, Scott, if you're the Cincinnati Bengals and you think you have a shot at getting a franchise-changing quarterback, a guy who can elevate the play of others around him, and really a guy who can rise above the shortcomings of ownership, of the front office, I think you have to take him. Now, is it a roll of the dice? Yes. Is it major? I mean, is it a major gamble? Yeah. But, and we've seen the Bengals botched this before. David Klingler, Akili Smith, they finally got it right with Carson Palmer, and that didn't even work out as well as many hoped. But I think if the Bengals feel that the quarterback is the best available person on the board and is a guy that could potentially turn their franchise around and a guy who can rise above the shortcomings of how this team operates, I think they have to take it. Now, again, there are a number of different interesting quarterbacks in this year's draft, and everybody has their personal favorites and whatnot. I don't know that some of those guys will be available at number 12 overall, so the Bengals might need to get creative if they truly want someone like that. But that to me is the biggest, and I think you kind of hinted at that a little bit in your article, Scott, is just the shortcomings of this team and how they're run. They need essentially a generational talent at quarterback, which I like Andy Dalton. He's done some good things for the Bengals. He's not a generational talent at quarterback. At least he has not proven to be such with the Bengals. They need a guy like that to be able to rise above that and get the team to where it wants to go in the postseason. So I think there's a lot of merit to your argument there. It's not. It's a polarizing opinion. It's not the most popular opinion, especially when you look at the team and you go, okay, interior offensive line, spoiler alert, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Potentially linebacker, some other, playmakers on the back end of the defense, even pass catchers, whether it's tight end or even another wide receiver. This team needs some help. But again, if you get that guy, the guy, quote unquote, the guy, if you fall into that, we've seen teams be able to do great things. You mentioned a lot of the names. Now, I will go back to Carson Palmer real quick. If you remember, yes, Marvin Lewis improved the roster. Yes, he and the Bengals did more outside free agency moves in the early part of Marvin Lewis's tenure. But that defense was, yes, they turned the ball over frequently, especially in 2005. Yes, they created opportunities in short fields for Palmer. But that defense was not good at stopping the run. That defense was not good at holding up teams to points and yards. They really had to rely, instead of forcing punts, they had to rely on getting a turnover. So that was a really offensive heavy team and an opportunistic on defense team, but there were still major roster holes at that point, and Carson Palmer elevated the play of a lot of players around him. So I see what you're saying now, Scott. Again, not to put you on the unpopular, the polarizing options here, but you look at, okay, there's potentially 5 first-round guys, and then I see a second tier of 2 other guys that really interest me. So obviously, the 5 first-round guys: Sam Darnold, Josh Rosen, Lamar Jackson, Baker Mayfield, and Josh Allen. Those are probably the guys that are going to go in the first round at some point. Then you have the quarterback out of Oklahoma State, and you have Luke Falk out of Washington State, who's a very interesting and athletic guy himself. So do you have, obviously, where they take these guys plays into it, but do you have a couple of guys where you go, yeah, that's the guy? And to me, I think no matter who they take, I still think it's a 1 to 2 year sit behind Dalton, let him watch and learn, because some of these guys are young, some of them are a bit raw. So I do think there's a watch and learn aspect to it. But do you have a couple of guys where you're like, yeah, those are guys I really find interesting?
It's a yes and no. I mean, I have not spent a lot of time yet watching a lot of the game films, or video, whatever. I guess films more like the rolls like you see in the movie theater. So game video. I don't have like the 8mm projector to watch the film like in the old days. But anyway, I've not had a chance to see a lot of all of them play. I've seen a little bit of Mayfield, a little bit of Lamar Jackson. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to add the caveat that I need to see more before I have like absolute opinions. But there is a principle I guess I have. And the one thing I'd look at is if the Bengals draft a quarterback, if they feel that, that future can't miss franchise guys there, I'm not saying let's just grab a guy, say, forget Dalton, we've gotten as good as we can get with him. It's time to reboot. So I'm not saying just grab a guy for the sake of grabbing a guy like the Browns do every couple of years, or I guess the Jets do every couple of years too. But let's grab a guy if you feel he is that true, future chance to be that great player. But because you have Dalton and, his contract is a reasonable contract, he's obviously not getting paid what Jimmy Garoppolo is after his 8 years of or 8 games of serve. So you have a guy that can fill that gap and play. So I guess the thing I would want is whoever the player is who may not be ready now, may not even be ready next year, but kind of like an Aaron Rodgers thing. Hey, we're going to draft this guy. We don't need to play him. Let him sit for a couple of years. So who has the most upside? The guy that there's no way you're going to want to see him get on the field this year, possibly not next year, but that guy who seems to have the most upside, if we can just get him some pro coaching for a year or so. And who that guy seems to be based on the little bit I've seen, I think Rosen, Darnold, and Mayfield are the most pro ready. I think those are the guys you plug in right now. They can probably play starting, September 1st or whenever next. But the other two, Lamar Jackson and Allen, I think are the most intriguing because they seem to be the guys who have the most tools. What I've seen of Jackson, his accuracy, his passing, to me leaves a little to be desired. I think the athleticism is definitely off the charts. I'd love to see a little more accuracy, a little more touch on his passes, a little more where he looks too much like a JT Barrett at times, a guy who has one read, waits till a guy's too open to throw the ball. I'd like to see, and if that stuff's fixable, he definitely has the athleticism to be a wow guy, or someone like Josh Allen, who was just horrible this year in the regular season. Just bad stats against bad teams. Just what is wrong with this? But then you see him like in the Senior Bowl and in his bowl game. You're like, yeah, this is the guy we thought we were going to see. So those guys I think are very intriguing because the upside seems to be there. They may not be worth anything, but again, given a year or two of coaching, that those guys might become great players that don't get thrown in right away, that don't develop bad habits, that get a chance to really see the game from the sidelines, from the stands, and really get to see what they have to work on, get to work on it with a pro team that has the money, has the resources, really develop these players. So if I was to pick one without really having a lot of chance to watch him, I would lean towards a Jackson or an Allen, only because they seem to have that upside that we can afford. I mean, if you're a team like the Browns or the Jets or, someone grabbing a quarterback, you're not looking for that. You're looking for the guy you can throw in there, right away that take yeah. And those aren't that guy. So I understand that for other teams, it's a different need. For the Bengals, I'd say whoever has the most upside, regardless of how long it takes, and be ready, because that's what you're looking for. You're looking for that franchise guy that can carry your team, for the next 5-10 years, to take you to that elite level. You're not looking for that, that stopgap. You're not looking for Christian Ponder. You're looking for Peyton Manning if he's in the draft. And they may look at him and say, none of these guys are that guy. And then you pass. But if you decide one of those guys is there, I think, that has to be the pick.
Yeah. And I don't remember a draft class in recent memory that has had so many. I mean, I guess you could look at that 2011 draft, Cam Newton, Christian Ponder, Jake Locker, Andy Dalton, Colin Kaepernick, as a group of guys that, this is a pretty solid draft to get a quarterback. I don't remember outside of that, in recent memory at least, where there's been, just a really nice crop of quarterbacks that should be available both in round one and even in the maybe day two type of area. That being said, I also can't remember a bunch of quarterbacks that everybody seems to think are basically boom or bust. And, I saw some comments in the YouTube chat. I think it was from Aaron Siegel said, Lamar Jackson is an amazing athlete with below average accuracy. FYI, I live in Louisville. So he is a guy who has seen a lot of Jackson, obviously, and could have a bias there. To me, it's interesting you brought up Jackson and Allen as kind of the upside. I see Allen as a guy. I'm not really big on Jackson at this point. I see Allen as a guy that's very interesting to me, but he would need a year or 2 years to potentially be able to be a guy where you go, okay, here you go, man. Here, this is the team. It's yours. But the Bengals can't afford that luxury if they want to do that. Unfortunately, I don't think he's going to be there at number 12. My favorite in the draft, and I'm going to be a little SoCal homer here, is Sam Darnold. I do not like Josh Rosen. There's certain aspects. He's got a good arm and everything. There's certain aspects to his game and who he is that I'm not a big fan of. But I've said this a bunch on Twitter and on the show and other, I see a lot of Brett Favre in Sam Darnold. I see a gambler. I see a guy who's got an amazing arm. I see a guy who ran a pro system in college. And, a lot of people are saying, oh, he turned the ball over too much in last year and he kind of regressed. And that's true. But what's weird about Darnold is it wasn't so much necessarily the interceptions. I mean, that was an issue in 2017 for him, but it was more sack fumbles and his offensive line not playing well in front of him and things of that nature. Again, that's not to say I do not think that Sam Darnold I think he's a boomer bust guy. I think he could be the next great quarterback, or I think he could be, a guy that is just you look at it and he kind of falls the way of other SC quarterbacks that were highly touted, Matt Leinart, Mark Sanchez, that sort of thing. So those are two guys I like, but I do like Mason Rudolph, the Oklahoma State kid, and I do like Luke Falk. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, and I didn't see if you mentioned this so much in your post, but you can correct me. I think a lot of this decision plays into what happens with A.J. McCarron in the next few days and his the decision on his free agency status, right?
I would assume I'm going to guess that he's gone regardless. I mean, if he's a unrestricted, I think he's gone. If he's restricted, I assume they're going to trade him. I mean, obviously they tried to trade him during the year, so that tells me they feel confident in what they have. So yeah, it's really hard to say. I mean, well, I assume by the next time we do the podcast, we'll know for sure if the Bengals get anything for him or just lose him. And if they lose him, it's obviously frustrating, and people are going to hate on the Browns because they screwed that trade up, and we missed it getting a really good second and third round pick for a guy we're probably going to lose. But you did mention Darnold, and I forgot. I'm glad you mentioned him because I did see one game of his. Obviously, he's played more than one game. I saw him in the Ohio State game, in the bowl game, and obviously he was going up against a great defense. I didn't expect USC to win, and they didn't. So, but what I saw in Darnold, and this is going up against a great defense. To me, he looks like a great NFL quarterback. He made I know he had the turnovers, and they were some ugly turnovers, but against that pressure, against that front where he was constantly under duress, I could give it something of a pass. But when he throws the ball, I mean, he just looks like an NFL quarterback. He made all the throws. He made them look easy. They were soft, perfect touch, throw after throw after throw. You're just like, wow, like this guy is just. This is what you expect when you see someone that makes you think it's an NFL quarterback. I mean, then you contrast him with someone like Lamar Jackson. When you watch him throw the ball, it's nothing like that. But then there's an upside. Well, Lamar Jackson does everything else well. If he can develop that, he'd be amazing. Of course, how many people do you say if they could develop that? I mean, we're still waiting for Achilles Smith to develop that.
Yep.
But yeah, I will agree with you on the Darnold train. I'd be surprised if he fell to 12, but if he did, just watching the way he tosses the ball with very nice passes, so many passes where they were right to the receiver where no one else could get the ball except for them, and just throw after throw, like, wow, this guy has a future in the NFL.
Yeah, and in that game, I don't want to turn this into a recap of the Ohio State USC game because I'll probably start crying, but. I mean, if you did watch that game, though, and probably a lot of Bengals fans did, because number one, it was a high-profile college football game, and number two, a lot of them are Ohio State fans. But if you watch that game, he did make some other great throws that were either not caught or fumbled away, all that kind of stuff in that game. So, I mean, I think if you look back, if you really want to see who Sam Darnold could be, I think you look back to the previous year, the Rose Bowl against Penn State, and you see some throws in that game that are absolutely absurd. And that's why now Brett Favre isn't going down in the league as the greatest quarterback ever. He's one of probably top 5, top 10, but he was a guy who could shake off turnovers. He's a guy who had the utmost confidence in his arm, and that's what I see out of Darnold. And, I know I'm a little biased because I've watched a lot of him out here, but like you said, he kind of looks the part, and some of the throws that he made. But great article by Scott on Cincy Jungle, and obviously worth some conversation. I know a lot of people are kind of sick of the annual, Dalton reevaluation, I guess, with the Bengals, but I mean, at some point, and it goes to the same point of Marvin Lewis being hired, at some point you got to look at it and go, are we just kind of treading water? And I like Andy Dalton. I've met him. He's a nice guy, does a lot of great stuff in the community. But, I mean, at some point, you got to have a guy who can get you there. And, Boomer did it. Ken Anderson did it. Carson couldn't. But, and Andy Dalton hasn't been able to do it either. So, he's a guy, and I would assume you'd agree with me just based on who he is and his passion for the game and his spirit. And he's a guy you want to see do it. You really want to see him do it, but not just because he's the Bengals quarterback. He's just a likable guy and a guy who you see certain throws from him at times where you go, there it is. There it is. Like the Tyler Boyd play against the Ravens. That was an absolute dime. He threw it. And there's many others. you see it, but it's just not as consistent as you see it from some other quarterbacks. But great post, Scott. I'm glad we got to talk about that a little bit, and it's definitely worth some debate. I want to move on now, though, Scott, to the guys that protect Andy Dalton. Cedric Ogbuehi was a first-round pick back in 2015. He was kind of what we're talking about with, the sit and learn and, learn behind some good guys, all that kind of stuff. Played a little bit sparingly. He came back from a knee injury, played a little bit sparingly as a rookie, as like an extra tackle in certain packages. Then they gave him the starting role at right tackle in 2016. That didn't go well. They gave him the starting role at left tackle in 2017. That arguably could just got worse. I was thinking this week, Scott, when Cedric, part of the things that they liked from Cedric Ogbuehi, the Bengals, was his athleticism, his versatility, the fact that he played different spots on the line, all of that. If you go back and you watch either some tape or you look at College Football Focus, which is an offset, obviously, of Pro Football Focus, his best year was as a guard and at Texas A&M. Now, it's not easy to block, especially in college, for a guy like Johnny Manziel because he's Mr. Ad-lib back there. But I think I wonder, especially now that the Bengals are hurting at right guard, Trey Hopkins doesn't seem to be the guy that they thought he was. Andre Smith never got the opportunity to start there this year. Remember when they signed him, they said, "Oh, he could start a right guard." That didn't happen. So I'm wondering if now, especially with these mock drafts coming out, where the Bengals are taking either Connor Williams out of Texas or McGlinchey out of Notre Dame, I'm wondering if kicking Cedric Ogbuehi inside in his third year, like a Robert Gallery, could salvage his career and make him a serviceable starter with the Bengals. Now, there's a lot that goes into that. I mean, I think any of us who work any kind of job, if you're doing a certain job and your position gets switched a little bit and you're doing other things, there's a learning curve. There's, potentially you're just not as good at that job that you were initially hired for. But I just look back to that college tape and I see a guy who, even though he's tall and he's athletic, he's got the build for a tackle, he might be a better NFL guard. And now that the Bengals have a new offensive line coach, I want to discuss this, Scott. I mean, have you thought about this? Does the thought make sense to you? Or is he a guy that is just going to basically be, at this point, maybe a backup tackle in the NFL?
Actually, it is an interesting thought because I had a similar thought earlier this year about moving him to left guard. Because if you look at, what are kind of considered the traits, and obviously this is, it's very generalized, but each of the 5 offensive line positions tends to have certain traits they're kind of looked at. The left tackle is the guy that's supposed to be the best lineman. He's strong. He's also very athletic, someone that can move with the edge rushers and has the strength, take these guys one-on-one, just, you're super elite, great offensive lineman. Your, center is supposed to be a guy, according to Paul Alexander, can do a bunch of push-ups, or, according to everyone else in the league, is someone who's supposed to be, is kind of like that strong, stout guy. You're not really pulling him a whole lot, but can anchor, can hold his own. Your left tackle, your left guard's the guy who is probably the little more athletic of the two guards. He's probably moving a little more, and your right guard's more like your road grader. And like each one has like their own little stereotypes that they generally follow. That being said, you look at what Ogbuehi was kind of considered to be good at coming out of college. He didn't have the core strength. He didn't have the physicality. Didn't seem to have the natural instinct of a left tackle to be able to take on those edge rushers one-on-one. But he was called very athletic. He's a very athletic guy. We're just going to teach him how to play the position, and we're going to, make him lift weights. And obviously he's lifting weights, but to get to the NFL strength. So the thing he was good at was the athleticism, the ability to move, move in space, and And that's kind of what you would see in a left guard. Just generalizing that of the 5 positions, that seems to be the one where he'd probably have the best fit as far as what his strengths seem to be. But then I got to think, well, if you look at the Bengals line right now, who is their best offensive lineman? It's arguably Clint Bowling, who is their left guard. So the question is, if you're going to do that with Ogbuehi and try sliding him at left guard, do you move Bowling to right guard? Do you move him to center? Or do you say, well, do we want to mess with this? He's the only bright spot we have on this line. Do we want to move him? Obviously, they moved him to left tackle end of last year because they were kind of forced in that situation. And, the reviews were mixed. He didn't look horrible, didn't look great. So is that something you would do with your best player, move him out of the way to find Ogbuehi a spot? And then you look at the right side. Well, I think Westerman probably looked solid enough. You mentioned Hopkins. He wasn't awesome. He wasn't horrible. He, for a former undrafted guy, seemed to be decent, I guess, in his first. So I think the move to guard would be a reasonable one to try because he obviously hasn't shown it at either of the tackle positions. He probably never will be more than a backup or a low end NFL tackle, but I do think, that especially left guard, I think is one he could probably do, obviously playing, kind of in the fantasy football world, you just slide him at left guard, you put Bowling at center or right guard. But of course, that's not that easy because you have to assume all these guys can do all those different traits they have to do. And, it's like and with Ogbuehi, he is kind of like the guy that's hired at Dairy Queen to make blizzards, and he can't make blizzards for whatever reason. He can't figure out how to scoop put the ice cream in, scoop in the mix-ins, and mix it up. Okay, let's try him at Sundays. Okay, well, he can't sit and make Sundays either. Well, maybe he can make the dip cones. And at some point, you kind of figure they're a little different. Maybe he can do it. But then on the other hand, they're all kind of the same thing. and if you can't do the one, you can't do the other. In the back of your mind, you're probably thinking, you may not be able to do any of these. They're all ice cream. They all pretty much involve pulling a lever and putting ice cream in this thing. So either he can do it or he can't. And blocking obviously isn't Dairy Queen, but it's kind of the same thing in that, ultimately at the end of the day, you're trying to put your fat butt between a defensive player and a quarterback. And either that's something you can do or you can't do. So far, he's shown he can't do it. So I would be, if you were asking me to bet on whether he becomes a great left guard, assuming they did that, I would be inclined to bet he would not, but I'd love to see them try it. I'd love to see the Bengals, with the new offensive line coach, I'd love to see them take some chances and say, hey, let's try some things. Let's, we've had these guys sitting in the bench forever. Let's throw Westerman out there. Let's, shuffle these things, shuffle this lineup. Let's see if someone else can play center. Let's look at maybe signing a free agent, someone better than a Marshall Newhouse, an actual free agent. So yeah, I'd love to see him try it. And I'm hoping with the new coach, or the new offensive line coach, they do. But yeah, I think it's a great argument. I think it's a great suggestion. It's something I'd love to see him do. I'd be hesitant until I see him go out there and produce, but I don't think it can hurt anything.
It wouldn't be an episode of the Orange and Black Insider without a Scott Schulte reference to Dairy Queen. And I know you love your blizzards, buddy. I know you love your blizzards.
Well, it's Fat Tuesday, so I had to get one before Lent starts.
Oh, well, there you go.
So it was on my mind.
I'm sure. Cedric Ogbuehi and I've coached, high school level teams and whatnot. Cedric Ogbuehi is a guy as a coach that probably has to frustrate the hell out of you. Size, athleticism, prototypical build. He should be a dominant left tackle in the NFL. He's not. And by the way, Scott, you have a big fan in John McIntosh in the YouTube chat who says Cedric doesn't have the strength, meaning to move into guard, I believe. And he also followed that up with, boy, Scott nailed it with your analysis of Ogbuehi. But I guess I kind of think, say the Bengals draft or bring in a high-end tackle, and whether it's on the right side or the left side, and they, he is next to a good anchoring player, maybe that will help remedy some of the issues. And if you look at some of Cedric Ogbuehi's issues, yes, physicality, yes, strength is a bit of a problem, but it's also technique. It's also the ability to kind of be able to corral some of the faster, more athletic defensive ends and edge rushers in the league. I just wonder, maybe he's a guy that can team up with some guys in the middle and end up salvaging his career. Same, like, I mentioned him earlier. Robert Gallery was a guy who was supposed to be a can't miss prospect at offensive tackle. He was awful. Then he got kicked into guard, and he was like a Pro Bowl type of player. So, I mean, it's happened before. And I don't, I'm not sitting here saying that that's the cure-all for Cedric Ogbuehi. And I have a lot of criticisms of Cedric Ogbuehi. A lot of fans have a lot of criticisms of him. I will say this, if you follow him on social media or anything, at least the image he portrayed this past offseason before the 2017 season, I think the team made it known, hey, we're going to give you the left tackle spot. It's yours to take, and it's yours to potentially lose. I got to give him credit. I mean, it appeared in his offseason regimen that he was really doing a lot of things to help condition himself, do different workouts. He's doing a lot of MMA stuff. So, I mean, you got to give the guy credit there. I guess, and when I thought about this topic, I went back and I kind of researched some things, and I saw that Pro Football Focus, and again, that's not, for some people, that is the NFL Bible to grade and evaluate players. To some, it's kind of whatever. I'm kind of in the middle. I think it's a very good tool. I don't think it's everything, but I will say that when the Bengals drafted him back in 2015, and this is available on Cincy Jungle in their archives, there was a lot of Pro Football Focus people that were saying it's an outstanding pick. He's probably the top one or two offensive linemen in the draft. All of that stuff. Now, hindsight is 2020, but I mean, it seems as if the tools are there. And whether it's a tackle or guard, it seems as if the physical tools are there for the most part. Now, not every team nails their first round picks. Not every team nails every single draft pick they have. So maybe the Bengals had a miss here, but I think given the high stock that they have in him, that they've invested in him in terms of money and draft status, I think getting creative and maybe looking at some options like kicking inside might be worth a look, no?
Yeah, I suppose I need to go off mute. Yeah, I mean, it's something, like you said, after he was drafted in 2015, and I know he was injured part of the year, but he's had all of, part of 2015 season, all of 2016, all of 2017, the tackle thing clearly isn't working. I guess you can keep beating that dead horse and hope at some point it clicks. I mean, maybe he's just one of these guys that takes 5 years to figure it out. But do you want to keep struggling for 5 years? I would assume no. At some point, you just need to move on, try him. And so you have to try him at something else. You can't keep throwing him out there and getting him Dalton killed because, as we're talking about earlier about elite quarterbacks or whatever, I mean, obviously Andy Dalton, he has his good moments, his bad moments. The one thing he struggles with is pressure. It's either going to be a sack or a ball thrown, to the cheerleaders or the cameraman on the sideline. And occasionally when he actually does decide, I'm going to make a play, I'm going to extend a play, I'm going to do something fancy, he throws an interception, and which I think is why he normally just takes the sack or throws it out of bounds. So that being said, you need to do whatever you can, as long as he's your quarterback, to build that line. And it's not Ogbuehi at left tackle. So, and it's not, it's obviously not Bodine at center. It's not a lot of things. So anything they can do to fix that, to change that, I think they have to look at. I think they have to be willing to say, we have to stop doing the same thing over and over. We have to look at something that works, because what we're doing doesn't work. We have to look at these crazy things like changing Peel's positions, halftime adjustments, these things that, are just so crazy for a Marvin Lewis team. I think they have to consider, if they're serious about winning, a postseason game sometime in, my lifetime, your lifetime. I'd like to see him win one in your son's lifetime, which, is another 80, 90, 100, whatever years, but it's not going to happen if they don't take these, at least show willingness to take some of these steps.
Yeah. And, man, I don't know if I have the heart to let my son be a Bengals fan, man. I don't know if I want to wish that on him, but you make great points. And I think what it ultimately comes down to, both in the quarterback conversation we had earlier in the show and this conversation, is the scheme of Bill Lazor and him and Frank Pollock, the new offensive line coach, being on the same page of what they want out of their offensive linemen. Now, Frank Pollock came from the Cowboys, and obviously the Cowboys did a great job of, and part of it was because poor Tony Romo was breaking collarbones like it was going out of style. They invested. They had Tyron Smith, top 10 pick at left tackle. Is it Nick or Zach Martin? I always get those two mixed up. In the interior of the line, Travis Frederick, another center that they drafted with a first round pick. So they invested high capital in it. So maybe it's just, you know what? Jake Fisher, heart issues. Cedric Ogbuehi, 3 years in, not working. We got to blow that up and change it. Or, maybe they mix in a couple of picks, mid-round picks, that sort of thing for the interior of the line, and kind of get creative with some of these guys and say, maybe Jake Fisher does have a future at right tackle. Maybe Cedric Ogbuehi does have a future in the interior of the line. I don't know. People far smarter than I am will need to make that call, but I do think that it's critical, absolutely critical. And unfortunately, this is Scott, I'm sure this has driven you nuts, but the Bengals have been a team who have on paper drafted well and gotten high, best player available, all that kind of stuff. But they seem to always, well, not always, but they seem to often try and fit square pegs into round holes, whether it's switching guys in positions. And I know that's what we're talking about with Cedric Ogbuehi, or trying them out at a position they excelled at in college and it just didn't work, but they still are so obstinate that they continue to try it. And if this team wants to turn things around after 2 poor seasons, they can't afford that luxury, right?
Yeah, and I think you nailed it in the head with that word. That is a great word choice. I think obstinate would definitely peg the Marvin Lewis era as far as, here's what I want to do, and I'm going to do it. I don't care what's happening in the world around me. I mean, the whole thing, the halftime adjustments. He's mentioned before how he hates sites like Pro Football Focus. You mentioned, and Greg,
I believe he called it a quote unquote dumbass website.
And I can agree if you don't like that one particular site, but the idea behind it of him rejecting, I think, is absurd. It's like you look at baseball, a decade or so ago, it was more the, like in the movie Moneyball kind of does a decent job of kind of showing the transition of sorts, the idea that it was more of a gut feel game. Yeah, the guy at the cigar, the scout kind of looking, he looks like a ball player. He looks good. You hear the stuff that guys like Paul Alexander and Marvin Lewis say, like, yeah, he looks like a player. He has the part, he has, that's a bunch of nonsense. You need to look a little deeper than that. And especially when you see the teams that are winning. And, Bill Belichick has made comments before where he's like, we don't use PFF. We have our own version, which means not only do they agree with it, but they have gone out of their way and created their own form of that. And a lot of baseball teams went through that growing period where the more, teams were more willing to take a chance to try something different, to get out of the mold of the old system and try to find an edge. They're trying to find any sort of edge. And so you have these sabermetrics and the WAR and the, ERA plus and the F5 and all sorts of stuff. Football is slowly starting to catch up, and some of the teams are starting to do stuff like that. Obviously, the site PFF's the most well-known because the first one to kind of come around that has been accessible to many players and I guess many fans. And some teams are adopting things like that. The Bengals are not one. They seem to be very obstinate, very old school, very, we're going to, that's a bunch of hooey, which is very unfortunate because you look at the history of the Bengals, the guy that founded them, Paul Brown, he was an innovator. You can look at the list of like all the things he brought to the NFL, like the face mask, the radio in the helmet, the huddles, the sending plays in, all this kind of stuff that he kind of innovated. And that was where they had their cutting edge. And you look at Sam Weiss, the no huddle offense and some of the things he was doing. And that's one of the cool things about the Bengals. They've had all these and then you get, Marvin Lewis, we don't need that. We're old school. We're going to let, time pass us. We're going to let the game pass us by, but we're going to stick by our guns and there's no consequences. I mean, he's not getting fired.
The consequences, new contracts, right?
Yeah.
And one thing though, you are very right about Paul Brown, and he is probably on the Mount Rushmore of NFL football, but he was also very obstinate. He was also he was stuck in quite a few of his ways, and I think unfortunately that's a trait that's been passed down to Mike Brown. And possibly the coaches that they hire, like you mentioned. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Cedric Ogbuehi in 2018. And if the Bengals, I thought that Paul Alexander not being retained was a significant move, whether that was Marvin Lewis's doing or what have you. It seemed like it was a Marvin move. So I don't know if that spells overhaul at the offensive line. But like you said, too, it's okay to be old school, but if you're old school, you got to draft players that fit that mold. You got to get the mean nasties up front. You got to commit to the run game and all of that kind of stuff if you're going to be quote unquote old school. And the Bengals just kind of that's what I've been bothered by the past couple of years, is that the Bengals don't have necessarily a true identity. They've got a lot of talented players. They've got a lot of good draft picks that, pundits have lauded for, the past handful of years. But it's just kind of like, well, let's get a lot of talented guys and throw them on the field. And there's not necessarily a true game plan. There's not necessarily flexibility. There's not necessarily a willingness to move other guys to areas that might benefit the team. And then when they do, you've got Jason Shirley, the guy that was a defensive tackle they tried to move to offensive line. And, if you watched Hard Knocks a few years back, Mike Brown suggested that Chris Harrington, a defensive end, be moved to tight end. And that didn't go over. So, I mean, I don't think they need to get crazy like that, but I also don't think that an offensive tackle switching to offensive guard is necessarily a crazy move either. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I'm Anthony Cosenza, joined by my co-host Scott Schultze. You can get this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and Cincy Jungle. You can also get in touch with us via email, theobinsider@gmail.com, and via Twitter at BengalsOBI. And we appreciate all the support, all the downloads, and thanks to those of you who continue to tune in live and interact with us. We love seeing all of you that continue to do that. Scott, I don't know how much time. We got a little late start tonight. I don't know how much time you have. Do you have a little bit more time?
Yeah, I can probably do one more segment.
Okay. Why don't we do listener questions then, if you're good with that? We've last episode, I wanted to do a fixing the Bengals in 2018, and I wanted to try and squeeze one in tonight, but I just think time-wise it's not going to work. So cliffhanger for those of you who are tuning in. We'll continue that and end it pretty soon. If you have some listener questions, you can send those to us, as I said, on Twitter at BengalsOBI, in the YouTube chat, or via email at theobinsider@gmail.com. We got a few, Scott, kind of from all over the place. So one was an email that I received, and it's from Chad Ruffner. I don't know where to begin with this one. It's a great question, but and honestly, it sounds like a fan who was attempting to cling to anything positive at this point for the Bengals. Now, granted, the Bengals aren't the 0-16 Browns or anything like that. They've won 13 games over the past 2 seasons, but when you've built up this expectation of getting to the postseason at least, I think fans now are they're restless to say the least. Chad wrote, he just kind of said, Anthony, give me reasons for optimism in 2018. There are, and I haven't emailed him back yet because I wanted to do this on the program, and I plan to, but there are many reasons for optimism, and there are many reasons for pessimism, unfortunately. Optimism, I think you could sit here and look at this roster and say that there's talent there. There's talent at a lot of positions, a lot of high picks at a lot of positions, a lot of former high picks at a lot of positions that they've grabbed in free agency or otherwise. Marvin Lewis is a polarizing topic, but, he's gotten them to a point that many other coaches haven't gotten them at under the Bengals' watch. They've got a top 12 pick this year, and they also will have obviously subsequent high picks in other rounds that they could use to immediately help their team. There are a lot of positives that you can look at this team and go, okay, you know what? They're not that far off. A lot of pessimistic opinions as well, Scott. So I guess try and talk Chad off the ledge a little bit with some of your reasons for optimism in 2018, and if the Bengals can make a quick turnaround in 2018.
Well, I think you nailed one of the key reasons for optimism is the roster. I still think they have a very good roster. You look at the skill positions, Joe Mixon, I think, looked very good. Giovanni Bernard showed he had life last year after kind of being underutilized the last few years. They still have A.J. Green, who's, made 7 Pro Bowls in 7 years. Boyd and Ross have upside that possibly one of them turns into a solid number 2. They may have Eifert back if he's healthy. You never know. Defensively, Atkins is obviously a stud. Lawson and William Jackson showed they were both, great players. Lawson was a great edge rusher. William Jackson was one of the top, cover corners last year. I think PFF, who we've mentioned several times this week, so might as well go with that trend. PFF, I think, rated him number 5 overall, rated him first or second in some categories like opposing yards per attempt, opposing QB rating, et cetera, et cetera. You have other than the offensive line, I think that's the big question. You can hope that the guy from Dallas, is going to fix some of that. I think one of the keys, you mentioned some of the offensive linemen earlier that Dallas drafted, guys like Frederick and Martin and Tyron Smith. And the key is not only did they invest high picks, but they were great picks. They took the right people. And that's the thing that I'm hoping he brings to this team is if they draft that lineman at 12 or in the second round, or when they make decisions of the guys they have on their roster. And also, a guy like Doug Free wasn't a high pick, but they realized this is a good guy. Let's grab him. Let's put him at right tackle. So if this guy can come in and if he can do something like that and say, hey, Alex Redmond or Westerman or whoever it is, this guy needs to play this position. This guy, we need to bring this guy in, that guy in the draft. We need to, if he can identify that and somehow do anything to fix that offensive line, I think they have enough other pieces around that. And I was foolishly optimistic last year because I figured outside of the offensive line, they have a good team. Unfortunately, this time last year, I wasn't expecting the offensive line to sink them as bad as it did. So if that can be fixed. So that's kind of the one exception is if he can come in and have some of those player personnel decisions on the offensive line that make the same kind of impact they did in Dallas, I think they have enough of the other weapons around the offense and enough decent players on defense that, with Terrell Austin come in, hopefully they can be more than just a collection of good players, but a good defensive unit that takes that step from being a solid one to a very good one. So, yeah, the pieces are there. I understand the reasons for pessimism, and the biggest one is Marvin Lewis. But I think the team showed in 2015 they could overcome that. They could overcome Marvin Lewis with a great collection of players, a great collection of assistant coaches who are doing well, and just so much talent and so much going for them that if they can get back to that, which I think they could, if they can fix the offensive line, that chance that they have the potential to be able to overcome anything Marvin Lewis may do.
I love that you brought up Doug Free, because if you look at Doug Free's career and what the Cowboys did, he was a serviceable, decent left tackle in the NFL for a handful of years. In 2011, the Cowboys drafted Tyron Smith, and in 2011, Doug Free played left tackle, and Tyron Smith played right tackle. Well, what they saw was that Tyron Smith was going to be a much better left tackle than Doug Free was, but Doug Free was still a solid tackle. And then they swapped in 2012, they swapped positions. And all of a sudden, Doug Free becomes a very solid right tackle for the Cowboys, while Tyron Smith becomes a Pro Bowl left tackle for them. So they had a very good line, and they were not afraid to make a change. It's something that was beneficial for their team. And, maybe Frank Pollock had something to do with that. I don't know, but obviously that worked out well for the Cowboys in general. And, Doug Free became a pretty dang good right tackle, while Tyron Smith was great on the left side. I guess this just comes down again to who do the Bengals want to be? And that the lack of identity, and that was one of our points of fixing the Bengals in 2018. The lack of an identity is something that has plagued this team. And I don't know if bringing Marvin Lewis back and maybe having Terrell Austin and Frank Pollock and a couple of other coaching changes is going to fix that. But if the Bengals find out who they want to be and draft the correct players for that image or that identity, then I think there are very good reasons to be positive. On the pessimistic side, unfortunately, I mentioned it before, because of the shortcomings in the front office and the way this team operates, the margin of error for the Bengals in terms of, because they don't do much in free agency, the margin of error in their draft picks, which they covet so highly, is very small. They can't whiff on a lot of guys, whereas other teams might, because they bring in other free agents and quarterbacks, coaching, that whole thing. And so unfortunately, the Bengals are playing with, I've said this before on this show, they're playing with a little bit of a handicap every year because of ownership and how this team is run. And they need to be able to get past that. I don't know that 2018 and Marvin Lewis coming back, supposedly wrestling maybe some power away from Mike Brown is going to do that. We'll see. There are reasons to be optimistic. There are reasons to be pessimistic. And that's about as best as I can give Chad at this point. Thank you so much for the email. Scott, we got a tweet at us it was on Monday by Charlie S at C Shrink, and he just says, "What are the expectations for Joe Mixon this coming season? Is he the guy? Should he be used like Jeremy Hill was used with Giovanni Bernard, where you mix in a healthy dose of both?" Obviously there's fantasy implications, and you're a resident fantasy football expert here, but Joe Mixon, unfortunately, kind of ended. He was kind of nicked up at the end of the year, but Giovanni Bernard stepped up quite a bit, and I don't. It was surprising, but I don't know that we should be surprised, because we've seen him do it. We've seen him play well. So it seems, by all indications, that Jeremy Hill's gone. Even by his own Twitter account, it seems like he's gone. So, what should we expect from Jeremy Hill this year? And might the Bengals take a running back in the mid rounds of this draft? Because Cedric Pierman is now a free agent as well. He's had some injury issues. Great special teams player, doesn't give you much on offense. And now you've kind of got what seems to be a two-headed Jabberwocky. That's the first time I've ever used that term on a show. Jabberwocky, a two-headed monster with Giovanni Bernard and Joe Mixon. Should Mixon get the lion's share of the touches, or did Bernard prove his worth a bit more at the end of the year and say, let's split this up?
I still think, based on what we saw from Mixon, his numbers weren't there, but when he had blocking, any sort of blocking, and wasn't getting tackled 3 yards beyond the line of scrimmage, he shows he is a very good runner. He's a natural runner, has good, all the things you want in a great running back, he has. And I think he deserves to get a lot of touches. That being said, I think you have to give some touches to Giovanni Bernard. You have to get him involved. And he showed last year he is still a very, very capable running back. I know there's a lot of hype for him. We were very excited as fans for him, back in 2013 and 2014 when he was subbing in with Ben Jarvis Green Ellis, who was kind of a plotter in the Cedric Benson kind of mold. And then Bernard comes out like, wow, this guy can catch the ball. He's fairly dynamic. He can make people miss. And then he kind of got lost in the shuffle when Jeremy Hill came out and he had his big year. And then we kind of saw him as more of like a third down guy. And then last year, or back in 2016, Bernard had like 300 yards and, low average and nothing too exciting. Well, last year he showed that despite that line just being atrocious, he's still a pretty good running back. So I think it's a good problem to have. I think they have two very good running backs. Of the two, I'd probably say Mixon is probably the more talented overall. Just the stuff he can do. I think Bernard's good too, but I think they have to play both, and I think they will. I'm not quite sure how they'll play them. I don't know if they'll do Bernard's the third down guy and Mixon is the Jeremy Hill role, because Joe Mixon showed he can catch the ball too. He's a very good receiver. He can block. He's a guy who could be a three down back if they wanted to go that route. So I'd love to see them do something like that and not do the predictable. When they had Hill and Bernard, it was very predictable. We're putting Bernard in there, and in these formations, it's going to be a draw play on 3rd and long to him, or it's going to be a screen pass. We put Hill in on 1st, 2nd down. We're running him right up behind Russell Bodine and just kind of hoping that miraculously there's a hole that opens up. I'd love to see them just mix these two guys and say, we don't care what down it is. We're putting Bernard out there. We're putting Mixon out there. And we're not going to tip our hand because they can both do everything well. They can both run well. They can both make people miss. They can both catch the ball well. They can both pass protect. So I'd love to see them just, ride the hot hand as much as, as a fantasy guy, I hate that. I'd like to have teams say, this is our guy and run with it. But, as a Bengals fan, I'd love to see them say, these guys are both good. Let's put them out there. Let's give them both the same chances on same situations, 1st and 10, 3rd and 5, 3rd and 1. Let's get these guys both out there, get them both involved. So I guess it doesn't answer the question. The question, I'd say I would expect Mixon to do more than last year, assuming the offensive line can't get any worse. I have to assume they hit rock bottom. And, unless we repeat the 1990s offensive line, we're putting guys like, Rod Jones out there. And so assuming the offensive line shows any sign of improvement, I think you would see a big step forward from Mixon as far as his yards per carry and what he's going to do, because he can make people miss. Instead of going from -5 yards to 0, he can go from 0 to 5 or 0 to 10, whatever that is. So I would expect bigger things from him. I wouldn't expect a huge season. You mentioned fantasy 1st-round pick kind of thing, only because I think they both deserve to be involved in the offense. And so I would expect Bernard to be fully involved as well. So you're probably looking at two guys who are probably going to get somewhere between 500 to 900 yards rushing, maybe 300 to 600 yards receiving, just taking a stab in the dark.
Yeah. Again, I think this kind of comes back to who do you want to be? What do you want to do? And obviously those two runners have two different styles and what they bring to the offense. I saw a comment from a couple of folks in the YouTube chat. Michael Myers, cue the Halloween theme, run a 2-back system with both in the backfield and make defenses guess if we run or pass. I love that. I love that idea in theory, and that's what the Bengals did in '88 when they had James Brooks and Nicky Woods. They did a lot of that. I just don't know if I don't know if that'll work at the current moment, but I would like to see more of that. Christopher Higdon says Mixon, Bernard, Brian Hill, Jarvian Williams were good at running back in terms of potentially adding another back. I'm going to say this. I definitely think you're going to see more touches from Joe Mixon. He had 178 carries and 30 receptions last year. First couple of weeks, eight carries, 9 carries, nothing. And then, weeks 3 through 5, 18, 17, 15, then only 7 carries against Pittsburgh, 11 carries against Indianapolis. So, and then, weeks 10 and 11, 20 carries against Denver and 23 carries against Cleveland. Both of those were wins, not surprising there. Joe Mixon last year had an 88.2% catch rate. And I think that's something to note in terms of, a lot of people think, well, Joe Mixon is a guy that is more of a running back, not necessarily great in the pass. I mean, they know he could do it, but that's something that goes overlooked. Giovanni Bernard, surprisingly, has a career around 75% catch rate, which is, kind of lower than I thought for a guy that's a receiving back. But I will say this, Giovanni Bernard is a guy that is a 3-down type of back. Now, is he a guy that you can rely on giving the ball 35 times, 35 rushes? No, not necessarily, but he's a guy who is really, really unheralded in pass protection. And if the Bengals don't do much to fix their offensive line, or, the similar issues pop up again in 2018, I think he's a guy that needs to be on the field quite a bit for that purpose. I think he needs to be a guy that is out there pass blocking, can peel off and get a catch. I would like to see, and there are great highlights of Giovanni Bernard, taking catches and going a long way with those catches. I will say that when I watch, there are times when I watch the Bengals games and I see right after the snap, I see it developing. When he's in the game, it's a very predictable screen pass play or a dump off or something like that, and I go, Gio, I just call it out because I see it. And if I can see it, I would think that opposing football coaches can see it. I would see, it seems as if there is a big play opportunity or a loss or an incompletion that tends to happen from Gio Bernard because of the predictability of the play calling. So I'd like to see them disguise that more, whether it's from Michael Myers' suggestion of using the 2-back system a bit more and putting them in at the same time. Sure, that could work, but, we'll see. Obviously, Gio, though, when given the chance, does shine. Unfortunately, he just kind of keeps getting pushed back in the pecking order. And I'd like to see them utilize both guys. And if the Bengals don't get after another wide receiver this year in the draft or free agency, maybe they just continue to split them out wide more. And if you remember, that's what Hugh Jackson did quite a bit. Gio Bernard was split in the slot as a receiver in 2015, 2014 when he was healthy, and it was effective. You have Hewitt, potentially a running back in the backfield, and then you split Gio out in the slot. I think that's a creative way to use both of them personally. But expectations for Joe Mixon, I think an increase of carries, obviously an increase of catches. I do expect probably a 1,000-yard rushing season, maybe a decent, probably overall a 1,400, 1,500 yard from scrimmage type of effort. He had close to 1,000 this last year. So, I think obviously the big key is efficiency in terms of those touches. Is he going to get 4+ yards per carry? Is he going to get, good pop these big catches off? I do think he's probably a mid-round fantasy pick if that's what we're talking about. But, I do think there's going to be a spike in his overall productivity. It's just a matter of efficiency. It's a matter of yards per carry and all of that good stuff. We're going to get out of here with one more question. Scott, I appreciate it. I know it's a little late on your end. We had, and I really wanted to get to this one because it's from Carlos Andre, who sent us a message on our YouTube channel. And he is from Brazil. Hey guys, Bengals fan from Brazil here. So we are international, my friend. What do you think about the quote halftime adjustments unquote? Do you think that Marvin will change his mind this season and start to do that? Well, this has been a season, and this is when Marvin was re-signed, even though that's not a change. There was talk of, there are changes, maybe free agency, maybe other things. Mike Brown he kind of played things close to the vest in terms of that in a recent interview. And it almost sounds like the Bengals are going to focus internally once again for free agency. We'll see. I halftime adjust. Unfortunately, Marvin Lewis is while he's kind of, to me, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Scott, but to me, he's kind of a macro picture guy. He knows how to build a roster. He does get, he does evaluate talent pretty well for the most part. I think overall we can say that. Sure, there are big misses, but overall, I think there's, certain big hits that he's had, and free agency, I would say, has been not his strength. There's been all kinds of guys, mostly on the defensive side of the ball at linebacker and other areas that have been really surprising. Antoine Odom comes to mind. The former linebacker of, I can't think of his name at the moment, former linebacker of the Buccaneers and the Broncos, who has since been subsequently arrested and jailed for some pretty horrific crimes, is another. Nate Webster, that's the guy. Other free agency gets, he has not been as strong on, but when Marvin Lewis has been at his best, it's been when he's had a number of different high-profile coaches as his coordinators, as his assistants, and there were, even in the early years of the 5-year run to the postseason, there was a lot of issues with clock management and halftime adjustments and all of that. Got a little better at some points, and then really the last 2 years, especially the halftime adjustments, that has been absurdly awful. So to me, I don't think, and not to use a ridiculous pun here, I don't think a tiger can change his stripes in terms of halftime adjustments. The guy's been the coach here for 15, 16 years, and he hasn't been able to grasp that concept, nor when he's been asked about it, he kind of just brushes that off as I don't know. So I don't think it's going to get better, but I could be wrong, and maybe overall talent of the roster and just a different focus that he might be bringing could change that. But I don't think it's going to get better in terms of the halftime adjustments. What about you, Scott?
I would say it's very, to your point, and we kind of mentioned this earlier, I think Marvin is more of a old school guy. I think for whatever reason, that's just not something in his DNA. And after, 15 years, if it's not there, I think you can safely say it's just, for whatever reason, it's not there. You don't feel it's necessary, can't grasp it, whatever it is. It's not, now that being said, you could hope that, hey, the assistants could do it. But then you look at, the offensive coordinator, Kevin Coyle this past year, when he came in, they were great in the first, they were better in the first half. And in the second half of so many games, the scoring just totally vanished outside of a couple games late in the year, like the Baltimore game or whatever, or the Browns, because the Browns were 0-16. Outside of those games, they basically disappeared in the second half. So it didn't look like that was happening on the offensive side of the ball. That remains to be seen if that'll happen on the defensive side of the ball with the new defensive coordinator. And you have to hope, deep down that they're at least doing something. They're not saying, you hope that most of these coaches have, obviously they game plan. We see this is what the opponent does. This is what we're going to do. And we're not only just going to do that, we're going to try to figure out how are they going to counter this and what are we going to do to counter that. So when the game comes, we have all that figured out. It doesn't seem like for whatever reason they do it, or if they do it, they're not doing it well. I would love to be optimistic and say this is the year that happens, but you can only see it happen, not happen so many times before you just realize that's just not something that seems to be one of their strengths. They seem to do a fairly good job of initial game planning. They've had a lot of solid, first halves in Marvin's career. Second half's a different story. And just for whatever reason, that just doesn't seem to be something that they grasp. I'd love to give a different answer to our domestic and foreign fans. I just, I can't really say anything other than just
Yeah, unfortunately, we talked about reasons for pessimism and optimism. I just don't know if this is a reason for optimism, and I hate to give that news down to Brazil, but that's kind of how I feel. Michael Myers in the YouTube chat said we need to play aggressive like Philly did in the Super Bowl. You can't slow down because you have the lead. Definitely, I think this team has lacked, especially the last 2 years, has lacked the foot on the throat type of mentality. They had wins sewed up and big ones that could have essentially. I mean, they finished at 7-9. If the season kind of played out a similar way, and they sewed up the win at Green Bay and they sewed up the win against Pittsburgh on Monday night, I mean, that's 9-7. That might get you in the dance. And unfortunately, big leads at halftime, and they just collapsed. And there are all kinds of little things, and unfortunately, that comes with coaching that you can second guess. But there are times where the Bengals defense has let up points and or a big touchdown right before the half. The Bengals get the football back with maybe a minute or so to play, and what do? They sit on it. And there are other times where they kind of crawl into a shell a little bit, and you'd like to see them be a little bit more aggressive. And unfortunately, I know Marvin Lewis has kind of poo-pooed this thought, and I know some people believe in this sort of thing, some people don't, but I think that teams and other coaches see this and they catch wind of it. And, the play 4 quarters type of thing. And, we've seen it's almost, I think I've mentioned this before, Scott, but it's almost as if when the Bengals get a big lead, they don't know what to do. And there are times, a lot of the wins that the 2015 excluded, but a lot of their wins in the playoff seasons have been, kind of come from behind, neck and neck, back and forth. I can think of like 20 Ravens games that were like that. And it's almost like, oh my gosh, we're up by like 17 points at halftime. What do we do? And they don't know how to respond. They don't know how to call plays. They don't know. I don't know what it is, but it's troubling. And if you're a good football team, and maybe it's a confidence issue, I don't know. But if you're a good football team and you're coached well and you have talent and all of that, I just kind of feel like you have a big lead. You shouldn't really relent, and you shouldn't be able. And not only should you not give up 17, 20 point leads, what have you, with just 2 quarters to play, you shouldn't crawl into a shell and play a completely different brand of football that the Bengals have seemingly done with some of these. And this last year was the biggest example of that. So I don't know if you have an additional thoughts on that, Scott, but I've seen them really. It's almost like they play a completely different style of football in final 2 quarters when they have big leads.
There's really nothing to add other than you can watch. You go back to so many seasons, and that's just the Marvin Lewis way. There's things they do well. There's things they don't do well. The optimism thing is that the things they do well are probably still going to be there. But then obviously the negative side is the things that they don't do well don't seem to be something that's going to be changed until they have a new coach. And I think, obviously many fans were frustrated because they thought those things were going to change and a new guy was coming in. And unfortunately that didn't happen, but I guess all you can do.
Go ahead.
Well, I was thinking today in baseball, catchers and pitchers reported. So spring training is beginning, every baseball team starts 0-0. You still have the optimism until the season sets in and you realize, oh yeah, my team's not any good. So until that happens, you have that optimism. So I think that's one more thing is we have, 8 months of optimism. Obviously the draft's going to come up unless they just absolutely bomb it and have a Cleveland Browns type of draft. There's some reason for optimism there. So, until week 1, week 2, week 3 start out, unless they start out 0-3, we've got reason for optimism until they prove us wrong. And I'm hoping they don't, but
Yeah, and the other unfortunate side to this coin is that not only do the Bengals not make necessary halftime adjustments seemingly when they have a big lead, they also fail to do so when they are down a bit. We've seen some comeback wins. We've seen some great games from Andy Dalton and the crew, but there have also been times, and I can think of, I believe it was weeks 14 and 15 this year against the Bears and the Vikings, where they were absolutely throttled and nothing changed after halftime from there. So I don't know what to make of it. I don't know. I think it's an amalgam of issues that, Marvin Lewis maybe doesn't do a great job of it. Maybe his assistants don't do a great job of it. And maybe, conditioning, maybe talent level. I don't know. All of that stuff might play into that. We'll see. But I wish I had better news for Brazil, but I do not at this point, unfortunately. But thanks so much for the question. Thank you all for your questions this week, and thank you all for tuning in live. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I'm Anthony Cosenza. My co-host Scott Schulte joined me tonight, and we appreciate all of your feedback, all of your input, and the fact that you support this show. You can follow us on Twitter at BengalsOBI. You can get in touch with us via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. And you can get the program on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and at Cincy Jungle. I hope that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. I hope that you subscribe to the iTunes list and all of that if you enjoy this program. And we hope you do. And if you have any feedback, let us know. I am, just so you guys know, I am looking to add more guests as the offseason starts to roll on and as free agency and the draft approach. So if you have any suggestions on people you'd like to hear from, we do have our connections, and we do have some people that we essentially have lined up coming up in the next handful of episodes. But if you have other suggestions and or people that you'd like to hear from, let us know. We would love to hear from you, and we'll try our best to get those folks on the program. That's going to do it for us tonight. Enjoy your Valentine's Day. Treat your significant other well even if it's only one day of the year. Treat them well. Spoil them. Do the right thing, and enjoy it. Since this is Tuesday night, enjoy your Mardi Gras if that's your deal. Be frugal with the beads, I guess. I don't know how that plays out, but be safe, be kind to each other. We'll see you next time. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. We'll see you next episode.